question we want to answer today is this: how do scientists use deductive reasoning and the scientific method to determine some of the characteristics of life? And we'll look at some examples of how exactly that happens. Let's consider some questions first. If you were to make a list of 7 of the main characteristics of life, what would they be? In other words, you take a look at this rock, you would say right away, not living. You take a look at this cat, you would say, living. What is it that makes a cat alive and a rock non-living? How do we know right away not living? How do we know right away living? So try to make a little list of some things that make cats alive and rocks not alive. Try to put them in order that you think would be the most important for survival. Like, which characteristics of life would make it easy for the cat to survive? And then consider your list again. Is there anything you could do to maybe break that list down into subcategories? For example, we would say cats can reproduce. We put 2 cats into a brown paper bag. We might expect a bunch of kittens sometime later. We put 2 rocks into a brown paper bag and shake them up. We would expect 2 rocks. But we can take reproduction and divide it into 2 categories: sexual reproduction or asexual reproduction. Cats, of course, reproduce by sexual reproduction. Bacteria may be more asexual reproduction. So are there any other ways we can break those categories down?
Amber has just graduated high school and is attending college in the fall. Recently, she broke up with her boyfriend and found out that she was pregnant. Her doctor suggested an abortion in addition to several other options. Before she makes her decision, though, she wants to know, when does life begin? Your task is going to be to help Amber decide when life begins by using some deductive reasoning and the scientific method.
So let's take a look at some of the characteristics of life then. Let's compare our list to perhaps what you have. One of the characteristics of life is that all the living things are made of cells. And humans are made up of trillions of cells. And each of those cells are specialized. In other words, blood cells have a completely different function than muscle cells. So all living things are made up of cells. But in humans, those cells are specialized. Skin cells are very different than brain cells, but they're all cells nevertheless. And we have trillions of those cells. Another characteristic of life is that all living things are made up of organic materials. Things like proteins, nucleic acids, things like DNA and RNA, and lipids. And humans are made up of many of those things. In fact, if we tried to get DNA from a rock sample, we would say, no way, there's no cells in there, there's no DNA in there, there's no organic molecules in there. But a cat would have DNA, and a cat would have cells, and a cat would have those things, just like a human has DNA, a human made up of proteins and carbohydrates and lipids, has lots of these organic molecules. Another thing that living things do is maintain homeostasis. That just means they keep their internal body conditions the same. So pH levels, keep those about the same, how acidic or basic something is. Our breathing rate, keep that about the same. Our heart rate, keep that about the same. Our body temperature, keep that about the same. So when we're working out, we sweat to help lower that body temperature in order to keep it about the same, 98.6 or 37 degrees Celsius. So humans can shiver and sweat to help maintain homeostasis of their body temperature, keep that body temperature about the same. Another characteristic of life is that we make and use energy. So living things like plants make energy, obviously. Humans, of course, use that energy. So when we eat food, we take that energy, or we take those molecules and break them down to get energy. We call that metabolism. So you might have a relative, perhaps a younger brother or sister, and they eat like 5 pizzas for lunch, and you're thinking, oh, if I could just have a slice of pizza without gaining 5 pounds. They have such a great metabolism, I wish I did too. Well, that metabolism just refers to breaking down molecules or building up molecules. All the chemical reactions of your body. All the chemical reactions in your body. And humans are going to metabolize calories so that we burn those for energy. It's a characteristic of life. Another one is adaptation. Living things adapt to their environment, so they're able to change to suit the environment that they're in. So for example, our cat in the winter time might get a thicker coat. In the summertime might shed all that hair, much to the dismay of their owners. Humans, we adapt with our immune system is a great example of adaptation. We get exposed to pathogens, to viruses, to bacteria, to things that invade our body, pathogens. And then we build up an immune defense to those so that the next time we're exposed to that same pathogen, our immune system is ready, it's adapted for defending our body and fighting off that infection. So all living things adapt. And one good example for us
is an immune system. All living things also develop and reproduce. So we have these stages of reproduction and development. So for humans, we measure that by our physical traits as well as our mental ones. So physically and mentally, how do we mature? So we grow up, we say that's a toddler because they're having a hard time walking, they're learning how to walk around. And then we say they're an adolescent, a teenager, they're an adult, elderly. So we go through these stages of life. A lot of them have to do with maturity, like mentally, and other parts of them have to do with physical maturity. But either way, human stages, just like other living things, we go through stages of development and reproduction. Living things reproduce. And finally, living things respond to their environment. So you might see something and respond as a result to that. You might, in this case, see a ball coming toward you and respond by moving your hands to catch it. Or you might see a friend walking down the road and you might yell hello and get all excited and respond to them. Sometimes the response is the physical one. You might move toward or away from the thing, stimulus. Some responses might be the emotional ones. You might feel anger, or you might feel sad when you see a certain thing. So, characteristics of life. Mom didn't know that she had ovulated the day of graduation, and there was a perfect egg waiting to be fertilized. Fertilization did occur the night of Mom's graduation to form a zygote and then eventually an embryo, me. Lucky for me, Mom's timing was perfect, and I'm finally able to move spontaneously. But Mom can't feel this yet. She knows something is going on. Her placenta, where her blood supply is practically mixed together, is giving me nutrients and antibodies to fight off disease until I can develop my own immune system. Mom's natural killer cell activity in her blood is lower now. When I was first conceived, her body released an immunosuppressant protein called early pregnancy factor, EPF, so that I wouldn't be considered an antigen or foreign body. Thank goodness. Take a look at some of the underlying terms or phrases and connect those with some of the characteristics of life that we just looked at. So fertilization has a lot to do with reproduction. Sperm meets egg. Zygote, then embryo, has a lot to do with development and living things reproduce and develop. Able to move has a lot to do with responsiveness to the environment. We're able to respond by movement. So that I wouldn't be considered an An antigen or foreign body is an example of adaptation. It's a great adaptation to release an early pregnancy factor so that the mother's immune system won't destroy the baby. Some other characteristics of life. Organization. Living things are organized. Now, in this chart, it's going to start with molecule, but we can even start with something above that, smaller than that, elements and atoms. So atoms like carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen make up things like molecules. Water, for example, ammonia, for example, glucose, sugar, for example. Those molecules then assemble to make up cells. Cells can assemble to make tissues. Similar cells grouped together make tissues. Tissues can make up organs. So you might have different tissue types working together to make up a heart, let's say. Organs make up organ systems. So you have the heart and blood vessels all making up the cardiovascular system. But again, let's think about this. Might there be a level between molecule and cell? Like, are cells just made up of molecules, or do those molecules make up things that help cells work? And the answer is yes. There is a level between molecules and cells, and that happens to be organelles. So organelles are parts of a cell, just like organs in a body are parts of a body. Organelles are parts of a cell that help the cell do its basic functions, like ribosomes make up proteins. The nucleus is the control center of the cell. Mitochondria give energy or help produce energy for the cell. So organelles make up cells. Once we have systems, in this case, in the human body, we have 11 body systems. That's going to make up an individual. Individuals make up a population. So here we have a population of people, but that might just as easily be a population of dogs or a population of deer. They're all just basically the same individuals. A community, though, includes other populations. So populations put together make up a community. So now we're getting into more environmental kind of sciences and ecology. But a community then, if you put it into its physical atmosphere, that's called an ecosystem. So now you're including things like water availability, humidity, temperatures, and soil types, the physical environment around. And then of course when you include all those different kinds of physical environments, like deserts or tundras, savannas, deciduous forest region, that makes up the biosphere, the places on Earth that can actually support life, the biosphere. Now if I said everything in this room, so if I'm including everything in this room, what level of organization is that going to be? Everything in this room, is that going to be just one individual or a population of students? Is it going to be just a population of students, or will it also include the physical environment? Will it be more than just students, but also the spiders and flies that might be in the room as well? If it includes more than one population and the physical environment, everything in the room, then we will say that that's an ecosystem, because it includes both living and non-living things. So let's match up some of these characteristics of life with a descriptive statement. So unique genetic material, that sounds like DNA. Just like a fingerprint is unique, DNA is unique, except of course for twins, they have identical DNA. Pupils changing in dim light. That sounds like responsiveness. We're responding to a change in the environment. Heartbeat increases during exercise. So now we want to maintain our normal internal environment and our circulation. However, exercise is throwing that off. But we're going to try to increase our heart rate to keep that blood flow normal. That's called homeostasis. Eating and digesting food. That sounds like the assimilation or breakdown of chemicals. That's metabolism. Changing from a teenager to an adult. That sounds like growth and development, characteristics of life. At 11 weeks, my heart is beating 160 times per minute. I weigh about 7 to 10 grams, and I am about 2.5 inches in length. I'm a girl. Today, my fingernails and toenails finished developing. Now, my fingers and toes feel complete. I can't imagine being without them. Soon my reflexes will be developed. I know those will be important outside of my mom's uterus. Speaking of her tummy, it's probably a little bit bigger at this point. I'm beginning to secrete bile, which will be important for digestion. The amniotic fluid around me is really cozy. My brain is beginning to develop. Even though it's not the right size at this point, it's the same shape and structure it will be when I'm born. Lately, my mom's heart is beating faster than it used to. That's probably because she's pumping more blood to the placenta for my benefit. Soon, her morning sickness will get better. So here again, notice some things that relate back to the characteristics of life. Reflexes will be developed. So this speaks to development, growth and development, as well as reaction in the environment, the ability to respond to changes in the environment. Also, the brain is continuing to develop. It speaks to the physical as well as mental maturity. Let's put some of these levels of organization in the right order. So let's find the smallest level of organization and work our way up. So here we have atoms, things like carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen. Atoms, they form together to make molecules. Molecules form together to make organelles. Organelles will work together to support a cell. Cells will join together with similar cells to make a tissue. Tissues, different types of tissues will form organs. Organs working together will make a system, and that system, the systems, 11 human body systems together will make a person. And humans are unique. They're different than all other living things, and here are some ways how. You might look at that list and say, wait a minute, my dog can be aggressive too, and it's not a human. Well, that's true. So notice that there are things that are similar to all life forms. There are some things that some overlap between other living things and humans. It's just that humans do them on a much greater scale. And there are a few things that humans do that are so above and beyond all other living things that places humans in a unique category of their own. So humans share characteristics of life with all other living things. But humans can be aggressive in ways that your dog can't. For example, we could have an unmanned drone bomb a country thousands of miles away. That's just a different kind of aggression. It's a level of aggression to which your dog will never be able to attain.
Humans also have theory of mind. Theory of mind is just the ability to understand that other things think differently than yourself. You might think, well, my pet does that. My pet can understand that I'm thinking differently. But humans do it at a much higher level. So for example, if your pet were watching an episode of House on television, they wouldn't understand the interactions of the characters, but that different characters are thinking different things. But you can understand the intricacies of their dialogue, their actions, their body language to understand what they're thinking and how they're thinking, and that they're thinking differently. It's a much higher level than what other living things can do. You might also think that other living things exhibit traits of the golden rule. In other words, they recognize, treat others as you want to be treated. And that's true again to some extent, but humans can do this at a much higher level. Like we can show empathy not just for each other, but we can show empathy for other living things. We can show empathy that's abstract empathy, like we can see a picture and it can break our heart. We can see even an abstract picture and understand the horrors of that picture, understand like what it's representing, and that makes us think, and that causes us grief. And we can understand and empathize with all those horrors represented in that abstract way or in that abstract painting. You might say other living things can show anticipation. My pets anticipate a treat before they get a reward. Similarly, humans exhibit some anticipation, but far greater than other living things. So for example, we can delay gratification for months, years, maybe even decades. We plan for the end of our life to try to anticipate what our future is going to be. In extreme examples, you might think of the early Christians who were martyred are preparing for even a future after this life. So humans can show anticipation far beyond what other living things do. These last two represent categories in which there is no real comparison to other living things. Humans have a culture, different cultures, very detailed and intricate cultures that are not represented in any other groups of living things. It's just absolutely unique. There is no real comparison between you standing in a Congo line at a 50s dance and any other thing that happens with living things. And then the desire to do the impossible. Not just to go to the moon, swim the English Channel, climb Mount Everest, but to do things like forgive the unforgivable or love the unlovable, things that are absolutely impossible for other living things. When a sperm fertilizes an egg, what is the result? So we have a cell fertilization results in one cell. When we think about the scientific method, we're just looking at a systematic approach to some kind of a problem. Typically this starts off with an observation. We make an observation about something. It could be quantitative, that means we're going to take some measurements. How much does it weigh? How much volume does it fill? What's the length and width? Those kind of things. We're going to use numbers, quantities. Other kind of observations can be qualitative. We might say, is it rough or smooth? What color is it? Things that just describe the quality of that. So we make all these observations about the world around us, or some specific phenomena that we see, or something interesting that we want to discover. We first make all kinds of observations. Then we come up with a hypothesis. Hypothesis is just a testable statement. Good hypotheses are not only testable, but they show some kind of relationship. So like an if-then kind of statement is the most helpful. So for example, we might say chocolate and pimples. That might be our example. So we might notice, is there a connection between chocolate and pimples? Now we can definitely test that. So let's put that into an if-then statement. So if chocolate causes pimples, then the more chocolate we have or we eat, the more pimples we'll get. So we're showing a relationship between the two. And then we can test that with an experiment. One group we give 1 chocolate bar, the next group we give 2 chocolate bars a day, the third group we give 5 chocolate bars a day, and then we just compare, which group gets the most pimples, and is there a connection between the two? So if we do that, we're working with some variables. In this case, our variables are the number of pimples and the amount of chocolate that they ate. Now I get to control the amount of chocolate that they ate. That's the independent variable, because I can determine whether I gave them 1, 2, or 5 chocolate bars. Depending on how much chocolate I gave them, that determines the amount of acne that they had on their face. So let's just suppose that the group that got 1 chocolate bar gets 2 zits on their face. And the group that gets 2 chocolate bars, let's say they get 8 zits on their face. And the group that got 5 chocolate bars, let's say they got 30 zits on their face as a result. So now I try to make a connection between the thing that I could adjust, that is the amount of chocolate, with the thing that actually happened, the dependent variable, because it depended on the amount of chocolate, the amount of acne that they had. The other way I could do an experiment is with control groups. I could have one group that eats chocolate, the other group that doesn't eat any. So now I have a control group, the group that doesn't eat any, and I would expect them to just have the normal breakouts of acne. But the group that has chocolate, I would expect them to have higher amounts of acne. So that would be my hypothesis. And I would just compare those two groups. Does chocolate cause acne? This is often the way that we test medication. So for example, aspirin or other new drugs that we might be testing, we test it on a control group and on an experimental group. The control group gets a sugar pill called a placebo. The experimental group would get the actual drug that we're testing, and we just try to see, is there a difference, a significant difference between the two groups for treating whatever it is that we're trying to treat. Once we do that experiment, then we want to analyze that data. What does it mean? So we might put it into charts or graphs, or we might somehow organize it in a way that's meaningful and we can kind of see, is there a clear relationship? We might do some statistical analysis even, get really mathematical, trying to see is there some kind of connection between those two variables. And finally, we want a conclusion that relates back to our hypothesis. Yes, chocolate causes pimples. Or, after we do our experiment, we might find that no, chocolate does not cause pimples. It's not significant enough. Either way, our conclusion needs to go back to that if-then statement of our hypothesis. Yes, there is a definite relationship between the two. No, there's not a relationship between those variables.
At 2 months, my ears and upper lip are completely developed. I can hear now. Mom's heartbeat is so soothing to fall asleep to. I must say that my heartbeat is pretty impressive too. It's beating so fast it almost sounds like the clicking of horses' hooves. I've doubled in length, which means I'm an inch long, and weigh 4 grams. That's about as heavy as 4 paper clips. My head is almost half the size of my body, but that will change with time. My gonads are slowly starting to differentiate into ovaries, and the iris of my eyes will soon develop. I hope I have green eyes, just like my mom. So here again we have some characteristics of life represented. We see the heartbeat. The heart gets back to homeostasis. We see the growth, of course, and development. We see the reproduction and development again being referred to.
Gonads just refers to things like ovaries and testes, the sex organs. So again, a good hypothesis is a testable statement, an if-then statement. So let's try to finish this statement. If a cell is living, then it will have the characteristics of life. So when we look back at what's the smallest living thing, we can go back to a cell if it has the characteristics of life. So we might ask, can a cell maintain homeostasis? Can a cell reproduce? Can a cell grow and develop? Can a cell metabolize? Make and use energy? And the answer to all those questions is yes, there are cells that can do those things. So cells are the smallest unit of life. When we think about the scientific method, we have to use some types of reasoning. Either it's inductive reasoning or deductive reasoning. The way inductive reasoning is this. We put like all of our facts into a funnel, and based on those facts, out comes a conclusion. So let's say we're worried about someone stealing cookies from our cookie jar. So what do? Well, we accumulate evidence, and from that evidence we can come up with a conclusion. So we might find a footprint, we measure the footprint, we try to see what size is that footprint. We might find a partial fingerprint, we might analyze that fingerprint, we might try to guess at the height of the individual if they could reach the cookie jar, and so we might talk about the time that the cookie was stolen. Based on all this evidence, we might come to the conclusion that it was actually Joey that stole the cookie. And we might be right, we might be wrong. Typically though, scientists use what's called deductive reasoning. In this case, we start with a conclusion, and then we try to find facts that support it. So we start with the conclusion and we find facts that support it. So our conclusion is, Joey stole a cookie from the cookie jar. And then we look at the evidence. We say, we found a footprint, it's a size 8. And then we ask, does Joey have a size 8? No. So that eliminates Joey. So we throw Joey out. Mary stole the cookie from the cookie jar. Well, does she have a size 8 shoe? Yes, she does. What was she doing between 2 o'clock and 5 o'clock? Well, she was at play practice, so obviously she wasn't around to steal the cookies. Alright, so we throw Mary out. Was it Johnny? Well, Johnny has a size 8. He had motive, he was hungry. He wasn't doing anything during that time that anyone can verify. And so based on we take our conclusion, Johnny stole it, and then we accumulate facts to prove that Johnny was the one that did it. That's deductive reasoning. So if we use that deductive reasoning, and we say a cell is the smallest unit of life because it has all the characteristics of life, then what observations can support that? So we'll say, like, does that cell have these characteristics of life? Check, 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 check. All that evidence supports that cells are living. So yes, cells are living, because that evidence supports our hypothesis. So So we already looked at some characteristics of life that were illustrated and underlined in the text. Now, what kind of conclusions can we make about when life begins? And if you were talking to Amber, what advice would you give her?
Let's take a look at the scientific method in action. So here we have some different chemicals. We want to make some observations of these chemicals. Then we want to test with an acid-base indicator to see which of these are acids, which of these are not acids, and determine what our unknown solutions might be. Might they be an acid or a base? So first I just look at the chemical formulas of each of these and just make some observations. Notice that many of them have hydrogen as one of the components, an H. Some, however, have a hydrogen all by itself, like HCl or H2SO4, whereas other ones have hydrogen right next to an oxygen, like NaOH and KOH. So if I put this indicator solution, bromethyl blue, into hydrochloric acid, it turns yellow. So now I'm going to experiment with putting that indicator into H2SO4, and it turns yellow. If I put the indicator into NaOH and it stays blue, if I put it into KOH and it stays blue, and I put it into HNO3 and it turns yellow, and I put it into CaOH2 and it stays blue, then that might give me an idea. If things are acids, like HCl, H2SO4, sulfuric acid, HNO3, they will turn yellow. Bases, where they have the OH together, they stay blue. So what happens when I get to ZN, so that stands for zinc, NO3. So if I put my indicator solution into there, I get a green color because it's neither an acid nor a base. What about my unknowns then? If I put my bromethyl blue into unknown 1 and nothing happens, and I put into unknown 2 and it turns yellow, then I might conclude that unknown 2 is an acid, whereas unknown 1 is a base. When we do studies that are for things like drugs, we do a double-blind study where the person performing the study does not know which are in the control group and which are in the experimental group, and the individuals that are in the study do not know if they are in the control group or the individual group, the experimental group. This is important to make sure that the data is unbiased. You don't have the placebo effect. Epidemiological studies just look for patterns in the population. For example, do blacks have a higher risk of heart disease? Do whites have a higher risk of obesity? And so we do this study to see a pattern emerge in the population in general. Whenever we're performing things in the scientific method, we want to ask some questions. We want to use our critical thinking because ignorance is dangerous. So we want to evaluate whatever information we're being presented. And in doing that, we want to ask some questions. So for example, is this information I'm getting consistent and reliable with other sources? Does it compare well to other sources? Is it supported by other independent studies? Is the source itself a bias? So for example, if you were reading in a muscle magazine about some supplement to take that's going to make you get big and strong in 2 days or less, you might wonder, is that source biased? Like, did they do all their own experimenting, and of course they want to sell their product? Were the results interpreted correctly? We often say things like, you can use statistics to say anything. So we want to be careful about whether or not we're interpreting results correctly. we might want to ask, like, is there any other possible explanation? Because there may well be. We've all seen TV mysteries where we're convinced that this one person is the guilty party, and then at the last minute we get some other possible explanation, and we recognize that our conclusion was way off, and the show gets this major twist in it, and we realize that it's actually something else. So we want to ask that same question when we're doing things in science. Is there any other possible explanation?